When I was 12 years old, my parents decided to finally split me and my younger brother up and give us our own rooms. I was a couple of years older than Alex, so I got the bigger space while he stayed in the box room. My dad wasn't too happy about having to move all his stuff down into the garage, but times change and I needed a room for myself. The four of us lived in a bungalow on a quiet suburban street, a rather reclusive area. Me and Alex would get bored sometimes as there really wasn't much to do, but for the most part, all we needed was each other. Being two young boys with no one else to play with in such a huge neighborhood, we were as close as two brothers could be. One day after school, we arrived home to find that all of my belongings had been moved into the room next to Alex's. I didn't expect to feel sad about it at the time, but deep down I knew that sharing a room gave us a stronger bond. After the realization that we could no longer talk to each other at night, we had to come up with a plan. I devised a childish kind of Morse code, a series of taps and scratches that we relayed to each other on the wall behind our beds. I knew that this way we wouldn't get caught talking in the hallway or become bored during the night. After about 3 months, we had become experts at our secret talking and had managed to learn just over 100 words. In a few months of doing this, there was only one night in particular that stood out among the rest. In the early hours of the morning, I was awoken by the familiar taps and scratches. This was confusing because Alex had never woken me up like this before. I sat up and listened intently to the words etched into the wall. It was vicious, it didn't sound like Alex, and some of it I couldn't even understand. At that moment, I noticed Alex stood in my doorway. "What are you doing, Jack?" I stared at Alex in horror as the Morse code upon the wall continued. Slowly realizing what was happening, he began to tiptoe towards his bedroom door. Peering into the dark room, he could see his window had been opened. Someone was in there. Alex slowly backtracked, making his way into my room and closing the door without speaking. We just listened for a moment. The taps and scratches continued getting louder and more ferocious with every second, becoming violently intense until the persistent scratching built up into a long bang. We couldn't take it any longer. We screamed as loud as possible and our parents came rushing in. In a fit of panic, we tried our best to explain to him what had been happening. Mom sat and comforted us in my room while Dad went and checked Alex's. Seeing the open window, he sprinted into the garden to investigate, only to find nothing there. After that, our parents tried their best to convince us that it was just our imaginations, but we'd know what we heard. After we had finally calmed down, we were put back to bed and all the windows were locked. An hour or so later, I heard more tapping at the wall. "Jack?" "I'm awake, Alex." "Me too, I just can't sleep." "Me neither. There's definitely something there, something wrong. I know." There was a long silence. "Jack, he's here. He's looking at me." "What? What are you saying, Alex? That's not funny." "Jack, he's staring at me. I've got to move." The tapping ceased, and Alex came stumbling into my room with a look of unconsciousness in his eyes. I shut the bedroom door and we sat on the bed shivering. We knew that there was no point in shouting. Our parents wouldn't believe us anyway. There would be no evidence of anyone being outside, and we'd most likely end up in trouble. Then we heard footsteps. They were accompanied by scratching that seemed to be leading from the outside of Alex's room and inching towards my room. The heavy stepping stopped, and a shadow blocked the moonlight behind the curtains. The window began to move a little as if it was being unlocked. We held our breath as it shook and creaked, but luckily it stayed closed. The figure leaned up against my window, almost completely shrouded by the shadows, and stared into my room for what felt like an eternity. After a while, the shadow walked away and never came back. I asked Alex the next morning what the man by the window looked like. He told me he couldn't remember, but it was not a man. After the incident, we both seemed to block it out of our memory. We got back to our normal lives and almost completely forgot about it. Alex got the worst of it, but he was doing fine, and that was the main thing. It wasn't until 3 years later that I realized it was never really over. I was 15 years old and freedom-bound during the summer of 2003. I had just finished school for the holidays and earned a 3-month break to do whatever I pleased. Me and my friend Paul had originally planned to stay at home playing video games the entire time, but those plans were soon shot down when I was told that Paul had to stay with his grandparents for a month. Paul spent a good hour or two expressing his love for the farmhouse his relatives owned, speaking highly of the lakes and fields that surrounded the home. Eventually I gave in. It was clear I was going to be joining him on his visit. After packing my bags and saying goodbye to my parents, I headed down the road to Paul's house, with Alex helping me on my way. Me and Alex were still pretty close, but the older we got, the more we would drift apart. There were no more late-night talks or playing out in the street together, and, well, I missed that. Once we had arrived at the house, Alex said goodbye, dropping my bag, and ran off towards the direction of our local sweet shop. Me and Paul hopped inside the car and were on our way. We arrived safely at the farm within an hour or so. It wasn't too far away, but looked completely different from where we lived. Just a huge house isolated in the middle of nowhere with only hills and trees for company. After we arrived, time seemed to fly by, and before I knew it, we had already been there for a fortnight. The area was beautiful and his grandparents were lovely, so I really had no complaints. One particular day after we had eaten our dinner, me and Paul headed out to explore some more and somehow managed to venture a little too far. We usually spent the evening playing around in the fields or climbing trees, but this time we ended up a mile into the maze of bark. Eventually we reached a small stream and decided to have a rest. The sun lay low and the twilight was fast approaching, but we couldn't head back without having some time to relax first. After a while, it began to feel as if someone was watching us from the surrounding trees. I looked around countless times, but didn't seem to find anything. I was starting to get on the brink of paranoia when Paul frantically pointed out a small wooden box that he noticed was floating downstream. All too excited to discover what was inside, I hurriedly made my way in the same direction until I was running so fast that I had overtaken the box completely. I leaned over the bank as far as I could manage, and I fished it out from the torrent. I looked back in Paul's direction, expecting him to be nearby, but he was more than a mile away. I couldn't have run that far, I said to myself. I sat down and slowly opened the box. Inside, I found a small photograph and a scruffy, hand-drawn picture. The photo seemed to be of a small boy on his birthday. He was wearing a party hat and stood surrounded by torn wrapping paper, a giant smile plastered on his face. Once I had managed to dry the picture off, I could easily make out a drawing of a family. There were 3 children and 2 parents stood outside of a dirty 2-story home. One of the children looked very sad and was separated from the rest of the family. Upon further inspection, I could see another person in the background, a much bigger man with an expressionless face staring from the corner of the house. It took a minute to register with my mind, but the events I'd hidden away from 3 years came rushing back. A shiver ran up my entire spine, and I picked myself up off the ground. I began to walk towards Paul, but my legs had gone weak. Then in the quiet of the darkness, I heard a noise from the trees behind me. Tap, tap, scratch. My legs suddenly worked. I ran towards Paul as fast as I could as we hurriedly made our way back to his grandparents' cabin. Soon after we had arrived home, I managed to settle down a bit. There were still doubts in my mind of who that drawing was of, but the noises that followed my discovery kept leading me back to the original fear. Was that me and my family in the drawing? Then who was the sad child standing on his own? What did the photograph have to do with anything? I went over the same questions in my mind over and over until the phone rang. Paul's Grammy handed me the phone and told me it was my brother.
Jack.
Yeah, Alex, it's me. What do you want? I have something I need to tell you. Okay, I'm listening. You know my friend from school, Tom? I think so. I've met him once or twice. Why? Well, that day after I said goodbye to you, I bumped into him down at the shop. And it turns out he lives on the same street as us. He always has. So why is that unusual? Well, it's not really, I suppose. It's just, why didn't we ever see him playing in the street? Maybe he wasn't allowed to go out when he was younger. Yeah, I don't know. It's just strange. It is a bit, but some parents are like that, you know? I guess so. That's not really the main reason I called anyway. I just found that unusual. I have something else I need to tell you, but it's a big deal. We've never really spoken about it. Okay, go on. Well, today I was at Tom's house and I ended up staying over for dinner. It got dark pretty early, so we decided to tell some creepy stories. For some reason, I remembered that night. You know, that night a few years back. I got the tourists to tell them about the guy and what he looked like. Yeah? Well, he freaked out. He forced his fingers into his ears and shouted. He kept repeating, "Don't talk about him. Don't ever talk about him." I didn't know what to do. His mom came running upstairs and told me I had to leave. I'm back at home now, so I think I'm safe. You should never come back, okay? What? That's when the phone cut off. I immediately rang back, only to be greeted by the sound of white noise. I stood there, shocked at what I had heard Alex say. A moment later, he called me back. Oh, sorry about that. The phone cut off. It's fine. Don't worry about it. I think we should talk when I get back properly. I'll be back home in a week. See you then. Cool. See you then, Jack. After I hung up the phone, Paul questioned me rigorously. I didn't tell him much of anything. There's really no need to, and I barely spoke a word for the rest of the time there, actually. After all, I didn't want to sound crazy, but all I could think to myself during that week was that Paul has always lived on the street as me too, so why didn't I ever see him playing outside when he was younger? Maybe I was just thinking about it too much. I came home feeling worse for wear and noticed that Alex was waiting for me by the door. I was told that Tom's mom had disappeared and left him on his own. All she'd taken with her was her jewelry box. Poor Tom went into foster care not long after his mom went missing. It wouldn't be until a couple of years later that I'd meet him again.